Nancy Jones and George Jones shared one of the most famous marriages in country music history, a love story wrapped in legendary songs, standing ovations, and a voice the world still calls timeless. To the public, George was the possum, the man who could break hearts with a single lyric. Beside him stood Nancy, steady, loyal, and almost invisible, smiling through decades of applause that never told the whole story. For more than 30 years, Nancy carried two lives at once. One belonged to the stage where George was celebrated as a genius. The other existed behind closed doors, where love and fear often shared the same space, and devotion demanded a silence few could endure. She did not leave, even when staying cost her more than anyone ever knew. Now at 74, Nancy Jones has finally stopped protecting the myth. What she chose to reveal is not about fame, or music, or legacy. It is about the truth she lived with, and the promise she kept, until now. Before George Jones ever became part of her life, Nancy Jones had already learned how to carry weight without being seen. Her story did not begin with music, fame, or a famous last name. It began quietly, shaped by responsibility, self-reliance, and the understanding that stability is something you build for yourself. Nancy grew up without the expectation that life would be easy. Long before she entered a world filled with tours and applause, she learned how to manage on her own, how to stay composed when circumstances demanded strength instead of comfort. These were not lessons learned overnight. They formed slowly, through years that required maturity and emotional discipline well ahead of their time. What defined Nancy early on was her sense of responsibility. She learned to take care of what was in front of her, to face problems directly rather than waiting for them to pass. That approach to life became part of her character. She valued privacy, consistency, and honesty, qualities that rarely draw attention but often hold everything together. By the time she met George Jones, Nancy was not searching for validation or excitement. She was grounded in who she was and what she believed mattered. Commitment was not an abstract idea to her. It was something practical, something that required effort and follow-through. Love, in her view, was not measured by intensity alone, but by presence and reliability. This grounding mattered later, but it existed first. Too often, Nancy's identity has been framed only in relation to George. That framing misses the truth. She was not shaped by his fame. She arrived with her own sense of self already intact. The strength she would later rely on was not learned inside that marriage. It was carried into it. Nancy understood endurance before she ever understood celebrity. She knew how to remain steady during uncertainty, how to absorb stress without spectacle. These qualities did not come from denial or detachment. They came from engagement with life as it actually was. She did not expect perfection, and she did not rely on illusion to feel secure. Her values leaned toward simplicity. She preferred sincerity over display, substance over attention. This perspective influenced every major decision she made. When she later chose commitment, it was not because she was swept away by romance. It was because she believed in standing by the choices she made, even when they required sacrifice. This early chapter of Nancy's life explains what followed. It explains why she could enter a complicated relationship with clear eyes. It explains why she understood the difference between loving someone and losing herself. And it explains why silence, later on, felt like a responsibility rather than a surrender. Before George Jones, Nancy Jones had already learned how to endure without applause. She had learned how to stay present when things were difficult, and how to carry herself with dignity when recognition was absent. These traits would become essential, but they were not created by what came next. They were already there, waiting for a life that would demand every one of them. Before Nancy Jones ever entered his life, George Jones was already a finished legend in the eyes of the public, even though his personal life was anything but settled. By the time their paths crossed, He had spent decades building a career that made him one of the most respected voices in country music. The world heard greatness. What it did not always see was the cost. Born on September 12, 1931, George Jones rose from humble beginnings to become a defining figure in American music. His voice carried pain, longing, and honesty in a way few could match. Songs like "He Stopped Loving Her Today" secured his place in history, and audiences responded with unwavering devotion. Long before Nancy, George was already forgiven again and again by fans who believed the music mattered more than the man. That forgiveness followed him everywhere. As his fame grew, so did his struggles with alcohol and drugs. These were not late chapters or brief detours. They were ongoing realities that shaped his adult life and reputation. The industry continued to book him. Crowds continued to cheer him. The music continued even when stability did not. George lived inside contradiction. On stage, he was controlled, focused, and emotionally precise. Off stage, his life was marked by volatility and unpredictability. Addiction influenced his behavior and relationships, creating cycles that repeated themselves over the years. Success did not correct these patterns. In many ways, it shielded them. The country music world often treated George as untouchable. His talent earned him patience that others rarely received. Missed commitments, erratic behavior, and personal turmoil were frequently excused because the voice remained unmatched. That imbalance became part of his story, a pattern where consequences softened but problems remained. Despite the chaos, George was not defined by cruelty alone. Those close to him spoke of generosity, sensitivity, and moments of deep connection. He could be warm, thoughtful, and disarmingly sincere when clarity broke through. These qualities existed alongside his darker struggles, making him difficult to simplify and impossible to reduce to a single narrative. By the early 1980s, George Jones was a man revered by millions and unsettled within himself. His career continued to command respect, but his personal life reflected years of unresolved conflict. Relationships before Nancy had not brought stability. Fame had not brought peace. What it had brought was endurance, both for him and for those around him. George's identity had become intertwined with his reputation. The possum was not just a nickname, it was a symbol, one that allowed audiences to romanticize his flaws while celebrating his brilliance. That image followed him everywhere, creating distance between who he was and how he was perceived. When Nancy later met him, she stepped into a life already shaped by decades of history. George did not arrive as a blank slate. He arrived with habits, wounds, and patterns that were firmly established. The man she encountered carried the weight of everything that had come before, even when it was not immediately visible. Understanding George's life before Nancy explains why what followed was never simple. He was not a man waiting to be discovered or rescued. He was a man already shaped by success, indulgence, and forgiveness. The music had made him famous. It had not made him whole. That was the life Nancy stepped into, whether she realized the full cost at the time or not. When Nancy Jones and George Jones met in 1981, two fully formed lives crossed paths, rather than two people searching for direction. Their meeting came through a blind date, unremarkable on the surface, yet quietly consequential. George was already a towering figure in country music. Nancy was grounded, private, and secure in who she was. Neither entered the moment unaware of the other's reality. Nancy knew George's reputation before she ever knew him personally. His voice, his struggles, and his history were part of public knowledge. There was no mystery about the legend. What remained unseen was the man she encountered away from the stage. In private, George could be attentive and open, offering a version of himself that rarely appeared in front of crowds. That contrast shaped their early connection. Their conversations unfolded without performance. George was not auditioning, and Nancy was not impressed by titles or acclaim. She listened, observed, and evaluated with clarity. She understood that fame did not eliminate flaws, and she did not pretend otherwise. From the start, her approach to the relationship was deliberate rather than romanticized. The bond formed quickly, but it did not feel reckless. There was a sense of intention behind their time together. Nancy was not stepping into an unknown world. She was stepping into a life with visible complexities, choosing engagement over distance. George, for his part, responded to her steadiness. Her presence offered structure without pressure, something he had rarely experienced. By March 4, 1983, their relationship moved into marriage. The ceremony took place at the home of George's sister in Woodville, Texas, far removed from the spectacle that usually surrounded him. The setting reflected Nancy's preference for sincerity and privacy. There was no attempt to create a public moment out of a personal promise. The decision to marry was not framed as a solution to George's struggles. It was framed as a commitment between two people who understood each other's realities. Nancy did not believe marriage would erase patterns. She believed it would require honesty and effort. That distinction mattered. Early married life carried both hope and adjustment. George remained a public figure whose schedule and demands rarely slowed. Nancy adapted to that pace without confusion. She did not compete with the music or attempt to redefine his identity. She focused on building stability within the life they shared. At the same time, contrasts began to surface more clearly. Public adoration followed George wherever he went. Forgiveness came easily from audiences and industry alike. At home, life required attention, consistency, and care that applause could not provide. Nancy absorbed that difference quietly, recognizing that the work of partnership often went unseen. What defined this period was choice. Nancy chose engagement over illusion. She did not imagine George as someone he was not, and she did not expect love to simplify everything. She accepted him with awareness, understanding that commitment carried responsibility. Their meeting marked the point where two separate histories began moving forward together. Neither history disappeared, they simply merged. What followed would test the strength of that union in ways neither could fully anticipate, even with clarity. The life they began building rested on intention, but intention alone would soon face challenges that demanded more than resolve. Life together with George Jones unfolded far from the version most people imagined. On stage, his voice remained steady, controlled, and revered. At home, life required constant management, patience, and restraint. For Nancy Jones, marriage became less about partnership in the traditional sense and more about maintaining balance in a world that rarely stayed still. George's addiction did not pause for love or commitment. Alcohol and drugs continued to shape his moods and behavior, creating an atmosphere where predictability was rare. Nancy lived within that uncertainty, adjusting her own life around patterns she did not create but had to navigate. Stability was something she worked toward daily, not something she could ever assume. Public admiration made that work harder. Audiences celebrated George without reservation. Missed obligations and erratic behavior were often forgiven because the music endured. That forgiveness followed him home, leaving Nancy to manage the consequences privately. The contrast between applause and reality became impossible to ignore. Nancy later spoke openly about abuse, naming it carefully and without dramatization. Her honesty was measured. She did not sensationalize what happened, and she did not excuse it. She acknowledged harm while also acknowledging love, refusing to erase either. Living with George meant holding those truths at the same time. Daily life required vigilance. Nancy learned to read the environment, to anticipate shifts, to recognize when situations were changing. This awareness became second nature. Relaxation felt conditional, always tied to the moment rather than the future. Even during periods of calm, she understood how fragile that calm could be. Despite the damage, George was not one-dimensional. Nancy described moments of kindness, remorse, and generosity that coexisted with his darker behaviors. He could be thoughtful and compassionate, especially when clarity returned. These moments mattered to her. They explained why leaving was not a simple decision, and why hope resurfaced repeatedly. Isolation became part of the cost. Protecting George's privacy meant limiting her own voice. Problems stayed within their walls. Pain remained unseen. Nancy carried responsibility quietly, aware that revealing too much could fracture what little stability existed. Silence became both shield and burden. Friends in the music world, including Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, offered support during difficult periods. Their concern acknowledged George's struggles, but it did not remove the daily weight Nancy carried. When the house was quiet and the tours ended, the responsibility remained hers. Years passed within this rhythm. Hope followed periods of sobriety. Disappointment followed relapse. Nancy moved through these cycles with awareness rather than illusion. She did not confuse progress with permanence. She adapted. Even as the emotional cost accumulated, life together demanded endurance that rarely received recognition. Nancy's role required emotional labor that stayed invisible to the public eye. She was not simply the wife of a legend. She became the anchor that allowed life to continue, even when it felt unstable. This chapter of their life was not defined by a single breaking point. It was defined by accumulation. Each year added weight. Each decision carried consequence. Nancy stayed present, even as presence required sacrifice. That endurance would shape how she understood love, loyalty, and silence long after the music faded. What finally brought Nancy Jones to speak was not a desire to revisit the past, and it was not an attempt to redefine George Jones's legacy. It was a moment of reckoning brought on by her own survival. After decades of silence, her body forced a pause that reflection alone never had. In early 2020, Nancy became gravely ill with COVID-19. The illness was severe enough to threaten her life and permanently alter it. She later shared that the damage left her with a significant loss of lung capacity, a change that reshaped how she moved through each day. Recovery was slow, and the reminder of how close she came to dying never fully faded. That experience changed the way Nancy viewed time. For years, silence had felt like responsibility. Protecting George's story, and by extension the life they built together, had been part of her identity. Illness stripped that certainty away. Facing her own mortality forced a question she could no longer avoid. What happens to a story that is never told? Nancy has said plainly that without that illness, she likely would never have written her memoir. Survival created urgency. The years she had spent carrying truth quietly suddenly felt fragile. The story was no longer just about George. It was about her life, her endurance, and the reality she had lived inside for more than 30 years. In July of 2022, Nancy began working with writer Ken Abraham to put those memories into words. The process was slow and emotionally demanding. According to Abraham, there were moments when revisiting the past required restraint and care. Some memories carried weight that could not be rushed. Tears marked boundaries that had been held for decades. When Playin' Possum: My Memories of George Jones was released in the autumn of 2023, it did not arrive as a shocking exposé. It arrived as a measured account. Nancy did not sensationalize pain, and she did not soften it either. She spoke openly about abuse, addiction, loyalty, and love, allowing each truth to exist without cancellation. Her honesty stood out because of its balance. Nancy did not strip George of his humanity. She did not reduce him to his worst moments. She acknowledged harm clearly while preserving the complexity of the man she loved. In her telling, George remained capable of generosity, remorse, and deep feeling, even as his behavior caused damage. Writing the book was not an act of accusation. It was an act of release. For the first time, Nancy allowed her own experience to stand alongside George's public story. The truth was no longer something she carried alone. It was placed into the record with intention and care. At 74, Nancy Jones chose clarity over protection. She did not seek to dismantle a legend. She chose to complete it. Her words added context to the music, depth to the myth, and dignity to the silence she had held for so long. What Nancy revealed was not bitterness or regret. It was reality. Love that endured, pain that mattered, and a truth that waited until survival finally made space for it. At 74, Nancy Jones is no longer speaking to preserve an image. She is speaking to preserve the truth of a life fully lived. Her story does not undo George Jones's music, and it does not ask the world to stop loving his voice. Instead, it asks for a fuller understanding of the woman who stood beside it, unseen and unheard for decades. George Jones remains a legend, remembered for songs that captured heartbreak with unmatched honesty. Nancy's words do not challenge that legacy. They deepen it. They remind us that behind every celebrated life is another story, often carried in silence, often paid for privately. What Nancy finally shared is not accusation, and it is not absolution. It is clarity. Love that endured without illusion, loyalty that carried weight, and a truth released only when time and survival made silence impossible. For more emotional stories, check out this video.